The ink was still wet when Dahlia Holloway slammed the ancient ledger onto the stone table, and the sound rang through the subterranean archive like a gunshot. "You erased me." 3 words. She had practiced them in the elevator, descending 40 feet beneath the streets of London, had rehearsed them in the cold corridor lined with iron sconces and portraits of vampire nobility she did not recognize. She had promised herself she would say them calmly. She had failed at that the moment she walked into the chamber and saw him standing there. Marius Nightborne, king of the Nocturne Court, sovereign of every vampire house in Western Europe. Silver-white hair swept back from a face carved from cold marble, dark eyes holding the particular still patience of someone who had waited centuries for things to resolve themselves. He did not look surprised to see her. That was the most infuriating part. "Miss Holloway." His voice was low, deliberate, the kind of voice that had ordered executions and treaties with the same measured cadence. "You should not be here. I work here." She opened the ledger to the page she had marked, the page where 3 months of records had simply ceased to include her name. Every acquisition she had made for the Royal Nocturne Archive, every catalogue entry, every correspondence with the vampire houses, every restoration project, erased or reassigned to other names, to names that did not exist. "I have worked in this archive for 4 years. I catalogued the Valdres collection. I translated the Sorencourt Blood Codex. I restored the Brennevar manuscripts that your own senior archivist declared irreparable." She pressed her finger to the empty line where her name should have been. "And according to these records, none of that happened. According to this, I do not exist." Marius Nightborne moved then, a single slow step that somehow conveyed absolute authority. The candlelight caught the pale planes of his face and threw shadows beneath his cheekbones that made him look precisely as ancient as he was. 700 years. She had read that in the records she was not supposed to have access to. 700 years, and he stood there in a perfectly tailored dark coat, watching her with those unreadable black eyes, and he said nothing. "Who gave the order?" she demanded, because she had learned in 4 years working among vampires that silence was never empty. It was a negotiating tactic. "Was it you, or was it Cassivar?" Something moved behind those dark eyes at the name, something sharp and cold. "You are not afraid," he said, as though this observation genuinely puzzled him. "I am furious," Dahlia corrected. "Those are different things. I want my name back in the record. I want the work attributed correctly, and I want to know why." The silence stretched between them for a long moment, and in that silence, the ancient archive breathed around them. Thousands of volumes containing secrets that could topple governments and tear apart the careful peace between the vampire courts and the human world above. Dahlia had spent 4 years down here, cataloguing those secrets, preserving them, and somewhere in the doing of that work, she had apparently become dangerous enough to erase. "Sit down, Miss Holloway," Marius Nightborne said quietly. "I prefer to stand." A ghost of something, not quite a smile, not quite admiration, but something in the neighborhood of both, crossed his carved features. "Then stand," he said, "and listen carefully. Because what I am about to tell you is the reason I wrote you out, and it is the same reason your being here tonight may have already cost you your life." That was when the doors at the far end of the archive opened, and 3 figures in the deep crimson robes of the Cassivar House Guard walked in. Dahlia had not had time to think. Marius Nightborne had moved between her and the door so quickly that her eyes could not track the motion, only register the result, him standing 2 feet in front of her, his shoulders wide and his posture carrying the absolute territorial authority of a predator who does not need to raise his voice to communicate that the ground beneath his feet is his, and anyone who steps onto it does so at their own destruction. "Lord Cassivar's men," he said, each word falling like a stone, "are not welcome in my archive without invitation. Leave now, and this breach of court protocol will be noted but not answered. Stay, and I will answer it myself." The lead figure, tall, pale-eyed, with the particular silver sheen that marked old vampire blood, stopped. His gaze moved past Marius to Dahlia, and what she saw in his expression was not frustration or fear. It was recognition. He had come here specifically for her. "The girl knows," the pale-eyed vampire said. "Lord Cassivar demands she be brought before him to account for it." "The girl," Marius replied, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than anything Dahlia had heard from him before, is under the protection of the Nocturne Crown. If Cassivar has something to say to her, he may petition for an audience through the proper channels. He paused. In writing, through me, Lord Cassivar is not king. 2 words, final as a sentence of death. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Dahlia could feel the weight of it pressing against the back of her neck like a cold hand. The pale-eyed vampire looked at Marius for a long moment, and then, visibly, and with evident effort, he stepped back. The 3 crimson-robed figures turned and walked out through the iron doors, which swung shut behind them, with a sound like the ceiling of a vault. Dahlia let out the breath she had been holding. Marius turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something on his face that was not calculated control. His jaw was set hard, his eyes darker than before, and in the set of his mouth she read something that looked remarkably like worry. Now, he said. You will sit down. This time she sat. He pulled 2 chairs to the reading table and settled into one across from her, and the conversation that followed rewrote everything. Dahlia thought she understood about the 4 years she had spent in the Royal Nocturne Archive. It had started, he told her, with the Brenevar manuscripts. She had known they were old. She had known they were significant. What she had not known, what no human archivist had ever been told, was that buried within the restoration she had painstakingly completed over 11 months was a secondary text, written in a cipher layer beneath the visible manuscript. A layer that could only be read by someone who had spent enough time with the document to understand the precise sequence of its color-fading patterns. Dahlia had not known she was reading it, but she had been. She had transcribed sections of it into her own restoration notes without recognizing their true content, and her restoration notes had been distributed across 3 vampire houses as part of the standard archival process. What does the secondary text say? She asked. Marius looked at her for a moment. It contains the names of every vampire who conspired in the assassination of the Nocturne Court's founding sovereign 12 generations ago. Among those names is the ancestral patriarch of House Cassivar. The air in the archive seemed to drop several degrees, and if those names are verified and formally entered into the court record, House Cassivar loses its legal standing in the court, Marius said. Its titles, its territories, its blood claims, everything it has built on the foundation of that original conspiracy becomes forfeit under the ancient vow the houses swore at the court's founding. He paused. Cassivar has this document existed for 3 centuries. He has spent 3 centuries ensuring it was never translated until you. Dahlia pressed her fingers against the edge of the table and breathed carefully. You erased me from the record to hide that I had done it. I erased you, Marius said, and his voice was careful now. The way someone is careful when navigating around something that matters, because Cassivar's intelligence network identified your notes as containing the cipher translation 2 weeks ago. I received word the same night. If your name appears in connection with that translation, you become a target that the Cassivar house will pursue to protect itself, and they are not gentle with the humans they consider threats. He met her eyes squarely. I thought if your name disappeared from the record, they might not be certain enough of your involvement to act, and instead they came here tonight, Dahlia said. Yes. A muscle shifted in his jaw, which means they have a source inside my court. Dahlia sat with that for a moment. She looked at the man across from her, the Vampire King, who had erased her work to protect her without telling her, without asking her, without giving her any choice in the matter. And she felt the complicated collision of anger and something else she was not yet ready to name. You should have told me, she said. You would have been more frightened. You should have told me anyway. It was my choice to be frightened or not. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said at last, and the word carried a weight that surprised her. I should have. She had not expected that. She had expected justification, the regal deflection of someone accustomed to making decisions for others without consultation. Not that simple, honest acknowledgement. It shifted something between them that Dahlia was not sure she knew how to account for. So what happens now, she asked. Now, he said, rising and moving toward the deep shelves at the archive's east wall with that fluid, silent grace that all old vampires had. You stay here tonight. You do not go back to your flat. You do not contact anyone outside this building. And tomorrow morning, we begin dealing with what you uncovered, properly and on terms of our choosing rather than Cassivar's." Dahlia considered this. "I am not a prisoner here." "No." He looked back at her over his shoulder, and for the first time she thought she saw something that might eventually become a different kind of expression entirely. "You are a guest. There is a considerable difference." He pulled a volume from the shelf. An index, she noted automatically, cross-referencing restoration records with cipher designations. "And you are, whether you accept the framing or not, the only persons alive who has read the complete Brennevar secondary text and retained enough of it to testify to its contents before the full court. Then I am also the only person alive who can destroy House Cassivar's claim to legitimacy." "Yes, and presumably the only person Cassivar needs to silence to make that impossible." "Also yes." She looked at him holding that ancient index, white-haired, and still as a painting in the candlelight, and she said, "Then I suppose we should get to work." Something shifted in his expression. It was brief, barely a flicker, but she caught it, and it was warm. Over the next 3 days, the archive became Dahlia's entire world, and within that world, she learned Marius Nightborne with the same meticulous attention she had always given to rare manuscripts. He slept during the hours of deepest afternoon, when the autumn sun was harshest, true to the ancient vulnerability of his blood, but he was awake and present for the long hours before midnight, and the longer ones that stretched until just before dawn. He read with a speed she found unnerving, pulling volumes and cross-referencing them with a memory that apparently retained everything it had ever encountered. He was, she discovered, deeply knowledgeable about the archive's contents in a way that went beyond administrative familiarity. He had read most of it himself over the centuries in the quiet hours when courts were sleeping. He also brought her food, which she found inexplicably touching. Not himself. There were staff, quiet human retainers who knew the rhythms of the court and asked no questions. But he was the one who specified what was brought, and somehow it was always exactly right. Strong coffee in the late evenings, something warm and substantial when the cold of the stone rooms got into her bones, small precise things she had not asked for but apparently needed. She did not ask how he knew. She suspected that 7 centuries of observing humans had given him a granular understanding of them that most humans lacked about each other. On the second day, she asked him about the erasure again. Not the practical logistics of it, those she understood now, but the specific decision to do it himself, rather than ordering an archivist to handle the record amendment. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I wanted no one else to touch your name." She looked up from the document she was cross-referencing. He was not looking at her. His eyes were on the volume open in front of him, but his jaw was set in that careful way again. The way it got when he was being precise about something that cost him something to be precise about. Dahlia filed that away in the part of her mind that had always been very good at recognizing significance. On the 3rd day, Cassivar moved. The alert came through the court's internal network. A series of coded signals passed between the building's guardian posts that Dahlia did not fully understand, but that Marius clearly did. Because he was on his feet and moving toward the archive's secondary entrance before the final signal had finished. He stopped when he reached the heavy iron door and turned back to look at her across the room, and in the distance between them, she saw the full weight of who he was bearing down on the moment. "There are 12 of them at the street level and 6 more that have found the secondary access tunnel," he said. "Cassivar is not asking any more." Dahlia was already on her feet, pulling on her jacket. "Then we stop asking too." He looked at her for a moment with that complicated not-quite expression. "You are remarkable," he said, as though the observation had simply escaped him, as though it was a fact he had been calculating for some time, and it had finally exceeded the threshold of things he was willing to keep to himself. She did not have time to respond to that, because the doors opened. The next 30 minutes were the most extraordinary of Dahlia Holloway's life. She had known, intellectually, that Marius was a 700-year-old vampire king. She had processed that information with the detached professionalism of someone who had spent years cataloguing supernatural history. She had understood it the way you understand a historical fact, as information, not as visceral reality. She understood it differently now. He moved through the archive with a controlled, Precise ferocity that was nothing like the violence she had seen depicted in films or described in the human-facing mythology that sanitized vampire combat into something digestible. It was fast and deliberate and deeply authoritative. The way he handled the Cassivar guards, who poured through the secondary entrance. Not cruelty, not savagery, but the absolute competence of someone who had been the most dangerous person in every room he had entered for 7 centuries. He was also, she noted with the analytical corner of her mind that never fully switched off even in the midst of terror, protective of the archive itself. He did not damage the shelving. He directed the conflict away from the manuscript cases. He was, even in the middle of this, a guardian of the record. 2 of his own court guards had arrived through the main entrance, and the situation resolved itself with a speed that left Dahlia standing slightly breathless in the middle of the archive, a heavy volume she had grabbed as an improvised weapon still clutched in both hands. Marius turned to look at her. A thin mark ran across his left cheekbone. Not blood, vampires bled silver rather than red, and in the candlelight it looked like a thread of moonlight on his skin. He scanned her with one quick, comprehensive look that took in the volume in her hands, and the fact that she was standing rather than hiding, and something moved in his eyes that was between relief and something warmer. "You held your ground," he said. "I told you I wasn't helpless. You told me no such thing. You simply demonstrated it." He crossed the room toward her, moving differently now. Not the controlled velocity of combat, but something slower and more deliberate, as though he was choosing each step with awareness of what he was choosing. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver mark on his cheekbone clearly, close enough to notice that his eyes, which she had always described to herself as black, were actually an extremely dark grey, like iron in shadow. "Are you hurt?" "No." She set the volume down on the nearest table. "Are you?" He glanced at his cheekbone as though he had forgotten about it. "This will close within the hour. It is nothing," he said it, with the complete indifference of someone for whom physical damage was a minor inconvenience rather than a source of fear, and she believed him. "We need to go to the court," she said, because her mind had been working through the implications even during the chaos, turning the problem the way she had always turned problems, methodically, looking for the load-bearing pieces. If Cassivar is willing to send 12 men into the Royal Nocturne Archive in open violation of court protocol, he is either desperate or he has already done something to change the balance of the court in his favor. Either way, waiting is not serving us. Marius studied her for a moment. "You want to testify?" "I want to enter the Brenevar secondary text into the formal court record," Dahlia said. "In my name tonight." She looked at him steadily. "You wrote me out of the record to protect me. I understand that now, even if I think you were wrong to do it without telling me. But the only way to actually end this is to write myself back in, formally, publicly, with the full text attributed and verified, so that there is nothing left for Cassivar to suppress. The information becomes a matter of public court record, which means silencing me stops being useful to him, because it is already too late." The silence that followed was the longest he had given her yet. "If you stand before the full court," Marius said carefully, "you will be seen. You will be known as the translator. Every house that has an interest in keeping the Brenevar conspiracy buried will know exactly who you are." "Yes," Dahlia said. "But I will also be known as the human archivist under the protection of the Nocturne Crown, testifying in the presence of the king, which makes moving against me an act of open war against your authority." She watched his face, which is substantially harder for them to risk than a quiet assassination. The not-quite smile crossed his features again, but this time it went further than it had before. "You have been studying vampire court politics," he said. "I have been living adjacent to them for 4 years. Some of it was inevitable." He was quiet for another moment, and in that quiet she felt the weight of what was actually happening between them. Not just the political crisis, not just the danger, but the accumulating evidence of 4 years of proximity in this archive, the hundreds of hours they had spent in the same space, without either of them fully accounting for what that had made them to each other. She had thought of him with wary professional respect and a complicated fascination she had mostly suppressed. She suspected in the light of the last 3 days that the truth was considerably more layered than that on both sides. "The court convenes at midnight," he said. "You have 2 hours." The Royal Nocturne Court met in the great chamber 3 levels below the archive, and it was unlike anything Dahlia had seen in her 4 years of proximity to vampire society. She had been in the archive, which was vast and cold and beautiful in the way old things are beautiful, with the authority of permanence. The court chamber was something else. It was cathedral scale, carved from the bedrock of the city above, lit by hundreds of candles whose combined light turned the space amber and deep gold. The vampire houses were seated in ranked galleries around a central floor, and the silver shimmer of old blood was everywhere. White hair, pale skin, the particular still quality of beings who do not need to breathe, and sometimes simply do not for long minutes when they are thinking. She walked in behind Marius Nightborne and felt every eye in the room move to her with the synchronized intensity of a court that was very good at identifying what did not belong. She kept her chin up. She walked at his pace. He moved through the chamber with the absolute ease of someone who had never for a single moment doubted his right to be anywhere, and she used it like a windbreak, not hiding behind him, but drawing from the architecture of his confidence to build her own. Cassivar was already there. She recognized him from the portraits in the archive's upper galleries. Lord Cassivar Drenot, head of House Cassivar, 400 years old and carrying every one of them in the sharp, calculating lines of his face. He was tall and very pale, with the silver-white hair all old vampires shared, and his eyes were the color of pale amber and held the particular brand of intelligence that is not wisdom, but is absolutely dangerous. When Marius entered, Cassivar's gaze moved from him to Dahlia with a smooth, unhurried sweep, and she saw the moment he understood what her presence here meant. Something close to respect flickered in his expression, and it was the most chilling thing she had seen yet. "Lord Cassivar," Marius said, taking the central dais with the calm inevitability of water finding its level. "Your men made an unauthorized incursion into the Royal Nocturne Archive 3 hours ago. This court will note that breach formally before we proceed to the matter that has apparently made you desperate enough to attempt it." Cassivar rose from his gallery seat. "The archive contains materials that concern my house directly. The breach was an act of protective necessity." "The archive contains the record of this court," Marius replied, and his voice had that low, carrying quality now, the one that needed no elevation to fill a room. "Its protection is not your prerogative." He let that land, and then, "Miss Holloway." Dahlia stepped forward. She had the document in a preservation case. Original pages, the secondary ciphertext she had written in her restoration notes, and her formal verification of the translation methodology. She had spent the 2 hours of preparation in focused, concentrated work, and what she held now was not just evidence. It was a complete archival case, the kind that could withstand challenge, the kind she had been trained to build. She set it on the presentation stand at the center of the floor and looked out at the assembled court. "My name is Dahlia Holloway," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had expected. "I have been the senior human archivist of the Royal Nocturne Archive for 4 years. 3 months ago, my name was removed from the archive records by order of the Nocturne Crown in an attempt to protect me from consequences resulting from my restoration work on the Brenevar manuscripts." She paused. "I am here tonight to formally place my name back into the record and to enter into the court's public documentation my complete translation of the Brenevar secondary text, along with the methodology that produced it." The sound that moved through the chamber was not quite a murmur. It was more like a held breath, collectively released. Cassivar's voice came across the floor with precise, controlled menace. "The testimony of a human archivist regarding internal court documents has no standing before this body. Blood law requires that authentication of historical records be provided by a recognized archival authority," Dahlia said, meeting his eyes across the chamber floor, "acting in official capacity under a registered court appointment. I am the senior archivist of the Royal Nocturne Archive, appointed to that position by the Nocturne Crown and documented in the court's employment register." She opened the preservation case. "My appointment gives me exactly the standing blood law requires. I checked." The look on Cassivar's face at that moment was something she thought she might carry with her for the rest of her life. "The testimony took an hour." She walked the court through every element of the translation. The color-fade cipher she had identified, while restoring the manuscript's upper text layers. The cross-reference she had used to decode it, without initially understanding what she was decoding, the section-by-section verification, against the court's existing historical records that confirmed the ciphertext's authenticity. She was thorough and precise, and she did not rush any of it, because she had learned in 4 years of archival work that the power of a record lies entirely in its completeness. An incomplete record is a record waiting to be challenged. A complete one is a record waiting to be law. Cassivar challenged her 4 times. Twice on methodological grounds, which she addressed with citations from archival standards established by the court itself, and twice on the grounds of the translation's political implications, which were not, she pointed out clearly, her concern. Her concern was the accuracy of the record. The political implications were the court's to reckon with. At the 4th challenge, Marius spoke. "Lord Cassivar," he said, from the dais, and the quality of his voice was something she had not heard before. Not controlled, not measured, but something with genuine iron in it. The voice of a king who has reached the end of tolerance. "You are challenging the testimony of my archivist in my court on evidence she has provided under my authority. If you have a contradicting document, produce it. If you do not, sit down." The silence that followed was absolute. Cassivar sat down. The formal entry of the Brennevar secondary text into the court record took another hour, and when it was done, when the final verification seal was pressed into the documentation, and the court's senior recorder confirmed the entry, Dahlia let herself breathe for the first time since she had walked through the chamber doors. She looked up from the documentation stand and found Marius watching her from the dais, and the expression on his face was fully uncalculated for the first time in her experience of him. Not the controlled, not quite smile, not the carefully measured acknowledgement. Something open and warm and old. The kind of expression that comes from something felt for a long time finally being allowed to be exactly what it is. The formal consequences for House Cassivar began the following morning, under the ancient vow the founding vampire houses had sworn, the covenant of the first night, as it was called in the documents Dahlia had catalogued. The verified conspiracy records stripped House Cassivar of its primary court seat and its territorial claims to the 4 districts it had held for 3 centuries. Cassivar himself was not destroyed. The court was not a place of execution for political crimes, and Marius, to his credit, had no interest in being. But Cassivar's power, the vast accumulated weight of it built on the rotting foundation of that original betrayal, collapsed with a thoroughness that Dahlia found both satisfying and slightly stunning. The source inside Marius's court, the individual who had given Cassivar the information connecting Dahlia to the cipher translation, turned out to be a junior court administrator named Veloth, who had been in Cassivar's debt for 2 decades over a blood law infraction Cassivar had suppressed on his behalf. Veloth was dealt with by the court's own justice processes, quietly and completely, and it was over within 2 days. On the 3rd day after the court session, Dahlia sat in the archive in the late afternoon quiet, the hours when Marius slept and the building had a particular hush to it, and she wrote the complete record of everything that had happened. Not the formal court documentation, that was already done. Something else, her own account, careful and complete, the way she had always written things that mattered. The way she had been trained to preserve not just the facts of events but their texture, the quality of the moments inside them, so that someone reading years from now would understand not just what had happened but what it had been like to be there. She was still writing when she heard the door open. She looked up. The light was different than she expected. Later. She had lost track of time. And Marius was standing in the doorway with the particular stillness that meant he had been there for a moment already, watching her work with an expression she was now experienced enough to read correctly. "You are writing the account," he said. "Yes." He moved into the room and came to stand beside the table, looking at the pages she had filled. His closeness in these post-crisis days had taken on a different quality, not the careful, politically calibrated distance of a king managing a sensitive situation, but something quieter and more honest, the closeness of someone who had stood very near the edge of losing something and had decided, having not lost it, to stop pretending the prospect was neutral. Including the part where I made the wrong choice, he asked, and there was something dry and self-aware in the question that she found unexpectedly charming. Including that part, Dahlia confirmed, and the part where you stood between me and Cassivar's guards before I had even asked you to. She looked up at him, and the part where you said, I held my ground. He looked at her for a moment. The record should be accurate. The record should be complete, she agreed. Those are related but not identical. The corner of his mouth curved, and this time it was fully a smile, not a not quite, not a controlled flicker, but an actual smile with some warmth behind it. And the effect on his face was extraordinary, the way a single shift of light can make a carved stone thing suddenly look alive. Miss Holloway, he said. Dahlia, she said. Because he had been letting him call her Miss Holloway for 4 years, and she was no longer interested in maintaining that particular professional distance when it no longer served any purpose she valued. Dahlia, he said, and the way he said it, careful and deliberate, as though he was placing something precious somewhere it would not break, sent a warmth through her chest that she was done pretending not to feel. I would like to tell you something. Then tell me. I made the wrong choice about the record because it was easier to manage a problem than to tell you the truth of what I was facing, and the reason I chose that is a reason I should account for honestly. He paused. I did not want you to be frightened because you being frightened is something I find that I cannot manage with the same equanimity I have always brought to other difficult things. He looked at her steadily. You have been in this archive for 4 years, and in that time I have found that your presence is not something I am indifferent to. This is not a political observation. Dahlia held that carefully, the way she held fragile manuscripts, with complete attention and steady hands. How long have you known that? She asked. Something flickered across his expression that might have been the vampire equivalent of sheepishness. Longer than I have been willing to name it. She thought about 4 years of late-night archive work, of coffee that was always exactly the right temperature, of a king who knew the location of every volume in this archive and had still, several hundred times, found reasons to be in the same wing she was working in. She thought about a man who had tried to protect her by making himself invisible to the historical record, who had stood between her and danger with the naturalness of someone who had simply made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. I have been studying vampire court politics, she said, but I have also been studying you. She held his gaze, and I think what you are not saying, because you are not entirely sure how I will receive it, is that this has been true for most of those 4 years. The silence was warm this time. Yes, he said. She stood up from the table, which brought her close to him in the way the archive's narrow reading spaces always made the distance between people feel different from how it felt in larger rooms. She looked up at him. He was taller than her by several inches, white-haired and pale, and absolutely still in the way that was not absence, but the very opposite of it, full presence without the nervous motion that filled the silences of most people she knew. You should know, she said, that I am not easy to manage. I will not be managed. If you want to protect me, and I think you do, you will have to do it while also telling me the truth about what you are protecting me from and trusting me to help carry it. I have noticed, he said dryly, that you are not easy to manage. This is one of the things about you that I find most compelling. He said the last words with care, and the warmth in them was unambiguous. Dahlia smiled. It was not a small smile. Then we understand each other. He reached out, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has all the time in the world and is choosing to use it carefully, and touched her face. Just his fingertips against her cheek, cold the way his kind were always cold, but gentle with a tenderness that had clearly been waiting a long time for permission to exist. We are beginning to, he said quietly. I would like to continue. The weeks that followed the fall of House Cassivar reshaped the balance of the Nocturne Court in ways that kept Dahlia busier than she had ever been. The court's senior houses circled the power vacuum left by Cassivar's fall with the practiced opportunism of institutions that had survived centuries by knowing when to move, and the archive became central to the sorting out of territorial and historical claims in a way it had not been in generations. Dahlia was in the middle of all of it. She catalogued disputed boundary records and cross-referenced them against 3 centuries of court correspondence. She translated 4 documents from dead languages that the vampire historians had not read in decades. She verified the provenance of 6 historical claims and, twice, found that the claims being pressed were based on forgeries, which she documented with the same thorough precision she brought to everything, and submitted to the court recorder without comment, leaving the political fallout to those whose job it was to manage it. Through all of it, Marius was present with a consistency she had begun to rely on without fully noticing the reliance until it was already load-bearing. He appeared in the archive in the evening hours, sometimes with a purpose and sometimes, she suspected, without one. He had read beside her at the long table or across the room at one of the lecterns, and they talked about what they were reading with the ease of people who have discovered that they think in compatible ways. Not identically, which would have been boring, but in ways that fit together, that challenged and built on each other. He had 7 centuries of direct historical knowledge about the events she was cataloguing, and she had a scholar's trained capacity to structure and contextualize knowledge, and the combination was extraordinary. He also, gradually, and with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, began to let her see him. Not the king. She had seen the king from the first moment, but the person inside the king, the one who had survived 700 years by understanding things deeply and feeling quietly and keeping the feeling private until it had very nearly become a habit he could not break. He told her about the founding court, which he had witnessed as a young vampire of 80 years, young by their standards, barely past the threshold of political understanding. He told her about the original construction of the archive, which he had commissioned himself, and why. Because he had learned early that the thing empires are built on is not force but record, not strength but memory. He told her about the centuries of building the court into something that protected not just vampire interests, but the fragile and essential balance between his world and the human one above, and the particular grief of watching that work required decisions that cost him things he valued. Like writing your name out of a record, Dahlia said one evening, looking up from a restoration she was working on. Like that, he agreed. His eyes were on her with that steady, fully present attention that she had stopped finding unnerving approximately 2 weeks ago, and had started finding something else entirely. You protect the things you care about by controlling the information around them, she said. It is archival instinct, actually. You minimize the footprint of the things that are vulnerable. He was quiet for a moment. That is a more generous framing than the one I have given it. It is the accurate one. She set down her restoration tool and looked at him properly. But the gap between protection and control is important, Marius, and I think you know that. I do, he said. The ease with which he accepted her directness was one of the things she loved most about the conversations they had been building. He never deflected her intelligence or tried to soften her observations into something more comfortable. He listened. He actually listened. I am learning that there is a way to protect someone that does not require removing their agency, and that the second approach is both more respectful and, as I have recently discovered, considerably more effective. He paused. You put the Brennevar text into the court record yourself. You made the testimony. No one could have done that on your behalf with the same authority it carried when it came from you. No, Dahlia agreed. And you gave me the space to do it. After you walked into my archive and demanded your name back, he said, and the warmth in his voice was fully unguarded now, the way it had increasingly become when they were alone. I was planning that speech for 3 days, she admitted. It was an excellent speech. He stood from the lectern and moved toward her with that quiet, measured approach that she had learned to read as intentional. The way he closed distance when he meant to be close, when it was not practical but personal. You are extraordinary, he said, and the way he said it this time was not the slightly surprised observation he had made in the middle of the crisis. It was something settled and certain, the kind of statement that has been thought through and examined and arrived at through honest assessment. You walked into a vampire court, in a world that your kind was never supposed to fully see, and you did not flinch. You built a case that brought down a house that has stood for 4 centuries, and then you sat down in the archive and wrote the complete record of it because you believe that what happened deserves to be accurately remembered. The record always matters, Dahlia said. Her voice had gone quieter. Yes. He was close enough now that she could see the details of his face clearly. The sharp planes, and the iron-dark eyes, and the silver mark that had long since closed, but that she could trace in memory. So does this. He looked at her with the full weight of someone who had decided, finally and completely, to stop managing the distance. Whatever this is that we are building, Dahlia, it matters. She reached up and took his hand, where it had settled against the edge of the table, and she held it. His fingers were cool and still, and she felt him go very quiet the way he did when something mattered enormously. I know, she said. It matters to me too. He turned his hand and held hers, and for a long moment they simply stayed that way in the candlelit archive, with centuries of history surrounding them on every side, and it was, she thought, one of the most complete silences she had ever experienced. He kissed her with the same careful, full attention he brought to everything. It was not a sudden thing. He moved toward her slowly, and she moved toward him. And it happened in the space between, their mouths meeting with a warmth that surprised her despite the cold of his skin. A gentleness that was somehow more intense than force would have been. Thorough and certain, and carrying in it the full weight of everything they had been building for weeks, and the larger truth of everything they had been moving toward for 4 years without knowing it. When they parted, he kept her face in his hands, and his eyes, close now, were the warmest thing she had ever seen in them. I have not wanted something like this in a very long time, he said quietly. How long? Centuries, he said simply. And in that simplicity was everything, the full scope of what 700 years of careful distance costs, and what it means to let it go. In the following months, the nocturne court settled into its reshaped configuration with the gradual solidity of things that have found their true equilibrium. 2 houses rose to fill the vacuum left by Cassevar's fall. Both of them older alliances that Marius had long maintained quietly, and that proved to be stable enough to hold the balance he needed. The archive expanded. 3 new acquisition agreements with vampire houses in Eastern Europe brought materials that Dahlia had been trying hard to acquire for 2 years, and the restoration backlog finally began to move at a pace that satisfied her, which was a high bar. She was still human. This was a fact that both of them were aware of in the way you are aware of something that is in the room with you all the time. Not anxiously, but with the particular attention of people who are not ignoring the obvious because it is complicated. They talked about it one evening in late winter, in the small private reading room adjoining the archive, where Marius had begun to spend the evenings when the court's demands were light. It was warmer than the main archive. He had arranged it for her, she suspected, though he had presented the change as a practical arrangement with the particular graceful indirection he used when he was being considerate without wanting to draw attention to the consideration. The court will have opinions, Dahlia said. She was cross-legged on the deep chair by the fire with a journal open on her knee, comfortable in the space in the way she had become comfortable with him, fully without calculation. The court always has opinions, Marius said from the chair across from her. I have found that it is generally better to govern in spite of opinions than in response to them, even on this. He looked at her steadily. Especially on this. He paused. There is a precedent in the court's history for long associations between vampires of the court and humans in the court's service. It has not been common, but it has existed. My interest in the precedent is primarily to note that nothing I feel for you exists in violation of any law of this court or blood law more generally. He said the last part with a quiet emphasis that she had learned to recognize as him being very careful to be accurate. You are not forbidden. Nothing about this is a violation. It is simply unusual. I have been unusual in this place since the first day I walked into it, Dahlia said. Yes, the warmth in his voice. You have. She set the journal aside. What do you want? She asked. Because she had found that the most efficient way to move through complicated things with Marius was always to go directly to the center of them. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she watched him thinking. Actually thinking. Carefully, with the full engagement he brought to things that mattered. Then he said, I want you here, not just as my archivist, though I value that incalculably, as more, as what you have already become to me. He met her eyes. I want the kind of time with you that I have not allowed myself to want in a very long time, And I want it honestly and openly, without managing the record of it. She thought about that phrase, without managing the record. From him, it was not a small thing. There is the matter of time, she said, not as a grievance, but as an honest accounting. You have centuries ahead of you, I have decades. That asymmetry is real. It is, he said, and I will not pretend otherwise. What I will tell you is that the years I have spent being entirely careful about everything have taught me that the things you decline to reach for do not wait for you. They simply do not happen. He looked at her with something entirely unguarded in his expression. I am not interested in declining to reach for this. Dahlia felt the warmth in her chest that she had stopped even attempting to suppress. Neither am I, she said. She moved from her chair to his, which was a thing she had been doing more often, sitting beside him in the archive evenings, with a natural ease that still sometimes made her stop and marvel at the fact of it. At how completely the strangeness of him had resolved itself into something that simply felt like Marius, specific and irreplaceable and entirely hers to be near. He shifted to make room for her with the fluid, unbothered ease of someone who wanted her there. His arm came around her, cool and steady, and she leaned against him and felt the absolute particular solidity of it. The court will adjust, she said. The court will adjust, he agreed, and if they do not, then they will be managed. He said it with the quiet authority of someone who has been managing courts for 700 years and finds the prospect of doing so again merely practical. She laughed, because she had started laughing at the specific confidence of him. Not at him, but with the genuine delight of someone who finds that the person they love is also funny, which is one of the best possible discoveries. He kissed her temple. She felt him smile against her hair. Spring came to the city above, with the particular determination of a season that has been waited for, and it found its way down to the archive in the form of longer evenings and the faint, filtered quality of light that reached even 40 feet underground through the building's light shafts. The archive itself did not change. It was what it was, vast and old and full of every secret worth keeping, but the quality of time spent within it changed. In the way that everything changes when the thing you have been building becomes something you can stand inside and look around from and recognize as finished enough to live in. Dahlia completed the revised catalogue of the Brennevar collection, which was what the manuscripts and their associated records were now officially designated, and submitted it to the court's formal register under her full name. It was entered without challenge. She also completed the cross-referencing index she had been designing for 3 years, the one that connected the archive's blood law documents to their historical precedents across 4 centuries of court records, and she presented it to the full court archival committee as a working tool rather than a formal submission, practically demonstrating its application to 3 ongoing court disputes and letting the results speak, which they did, clearly and loudly enough that the index was formally adopted into the archive's standard research methodology within a week. She was, without having framed it in those terms, rewriting her own record. Not just the 3 months that had been erased, but everything before them, making her work not just present in the archive, but visible, documented, linked to her name, in ways that could not be quietly reassigned or administratively erased. She built a footprint, careful and complete, the kind that would still be there in a century when she was not. She did not discuss this directly with Marius. She did not need to. He watched what she was doing with the attentive understanding of someone who speaks the same language, and knew without explanation that it was both professional and personal. A human woman making herself permanent in a place built for immortals, not in her body but in her work, in the record, in the vast and enduring memory of the archive that had become her life's work. One evening in late spring, she was working in the Niemieschonai on a new acquisition, a set of correspondence from a defunct vampire house in Prague that had been sealed since the 19th century and arrived in the kind of physical condition that made lesser archivists despair and made Dahlia feel the particular satisfaction of a problem that has finally arrived before the person capable of solving it. She was deep in the work, fully absorbed, when Marius appeared in the doorway with the stillness that meant he had been there for a moment already. She looked up. He was holding something. A leather document case, old, with the seal of the Nocturne crown pressed into its cover. "What is that?" she asked. "A formal appointment," he said, coming into the room and setting it on the table beside her work. "The position of Royal Court Archivist has been vacant for 60 years. My previous holder of the position retired to his house estate without a successor being named, and the role has been distributed among the junior staff in the interim." He met her eyes. "I am offering the position to you." Dahlia opened the document case. The formal appointment letter was inside, handwritten in Marius's own precise script. She recognized his hand now, had catalogued enough of his historical correspondence to know it anywhere, and it named her by her full name, spelled correctly, with her current title and her archival qualifications, and her 4 years of documented work listed in full. At the bottom of the page, his seal, and a second line below it in smaller text that read, "With my full personal and institutional authority, under the protection of the Nocturne crown, in perpetuity." She looked up at him. "In perpetuity is a strong word." "I am a king," he said, with the controlled not smile that was fully a smile now whenever they were alone. "I use strong words when I mean them." "This makes me the most senior human official in the Nocturne court structure," she said. "Yes, the court will have strong opinions about that, undoubtedly." He was entirely untroubled. "The court's opinions are its own to manage. My appointments are mine." She looked at the document for a long moment, feeling the full weight of it. Not just the professional significance, which was considerable, but the other thing it was, the thing he was saying without stating it directly in a formal document. "You are here. You belong here. Your name is in this record in a way that does not depend on me to defend it, because I have made it part of the structure itself." "Yes," she said. He crossed the room and she stood up from her chair, and they were close in the way that felt natural now, the way that had started feeling natural so gradually that she could not mark the exact moment it shifted. She put her hands on his chest and felt the absolute stillness of him. No heartbeat, no breath, just the quiet solidity of something that has existed for 7 centuries, and intends to exist for 7 more, and has decided finally and completely that it wants to do so with her in it. "I should tell you something," she said. "Then tell me. I am not going anywhere." She looked up at him. "Not because of the appointment. I was not going anywhere before the appointment. I want you to know that I understand the difference between those two things." His eyes were very dark and very warm. "I know," he said. "I know you are not here because of what I can give you. You were here before you understood what any of this was." He brought his hand up to her face the way he had done in the archive weeks ago with that same careful, precious gentleness. "That is one of the many things about you that I have been failing to say clearly enough for long enough." "You could say them now," Dahlia offered. He kissed her. Thoroughly and entirely, with the full weight of everything they had built between them. And she kissed him back with the same completeness. And the old archive breathed around them both, with the particular patience of things that have been waiting a long time to witness something worth the wait. The summer formal session of the Nocturne Court was the first one Dahlia attended not as an archive stamp member positioned discreetly at the record-keeping station, but as a named official of the court itself, seated at the formal dais in the chair designated for the Royal Archivist, a chair that had not been occupied in 60 years, and that had been prepared for this evening, with the particular care the court's retainers brought to things they understood to be significant. She wore black, because the archive's colors were black and deep gold, and she wore them well, and she sat in that chair with the composure of someone who has earned her seat and knows it. The court's reaction was exactly what she had expected. A controlled wave of surprise, the particular silver stillness of a room full of immortals recalibrating. 2 of the secondary houses registered formal objections through the court's protocol process, questioning the appointment of a human to the position. Both objections were answered in detail and with full citation by the formal appointment documentation that Dahlia herself had drafted. Because of course she had drafted it, she was the Royal Archivist, and the drafting of official court documentation was precisely her function, and she was very good at it. Marius presided over the session from the throne dais with the immovable authority of a king who has already decided how things will be, and is waiting, with patient civility, for the court to arrive at the same conclusion. He did not intervene in the objection process. He did not need to. Because Dahlia had built documentation to be self-sufficient, but at the moment when the second objection was dismissed and the session recorder confirmed the appointment as standing, she caught his eye across the chamber floor, and what passed between them was brief and private and entirely clear. After the session, the court's informal hour produced the particular variety of political conversation that follows a power shift, and Dahlia found herself engaged in it with 3 senior House representatives who were, she assessed quickly, trying to determine the nature and depth of her relationship with the king before deciding how to position themselves relative to both of them. She was direct with them, as she was direct with everything, and she was thorough, and by the end of the evening 2 of the 3 had shifted from assessment to what she recognized as genuine respect, and the third had gone away to reconsider, which was the best she could expect on a first encounter, and was honestly better than she had anticipated. Marius found her at the edge of the gathering, near the archive entrance, where she had retreated briefly to breathe and process. He moved through the crowd toward her with the particular ease of a man who knows every eye in the room is following him and has long since stopped caring. "You handled Vethron excellently," he said, arriving beside her. "He has not been spoken to that directly in a century. It was bracing for him." "He will be more honest next time," Dahlia said, almost certainly. He looked at her with the full, open warmth that he reserved for moments when they were as private as they could be in a crowded room, and in the doing of it made the crowded room feel exactly as private as they needed. "How are you?" Excellent," she said honestly. "It is a good chair." His mouth curved. "It suits you. Most things do," she said lightly, and the look he gave her at that, fond and certain, and fully his, made her feel as warm as summer. He took her hand. There, in the edge of the gathering where anyone might see, and held it with the quiet, unself-conscious confidence of a man who has decided what he is claiming, and is not interested in making it ambiguous. She felt the familiar cool steadiness of his grip and folded her fingers into his, and that was its own kind of record, a public one, entered into the court's collective memory as clearly as anything that had been written in the archive's centuries of documentation. They stood together at the edge of the court and let it be seen. In the months that followed, they built the kind of life together that defies easy summary because it is made of small things accumulated into something large evenings. In the archive and arguments about the correct methodology for authenticating disputed blood law documents and conversations about history that lasted until the hour before dawn when Marius would grow quiet in the particular way that meant the pull of sleep was becoming stronger than the pull of conversation. He conceded this with the grace of someone who had made peace with his nature, and she let him go with the grace of someone who had made peace with his nature too. And there was something in that mutual accommodation that felt like one of the most honest forms of love she knew. She moved her life gradually below the city's surface, not abandoning the world above entirely, but weighting her residence toward the court, toward the archive, toward the space they shared. She kept her flat for the daytime hours and the human necessities of her life, sunlight and open air and the kind of noisy, ordinary human world that she found she needed in doses. The way you need something to step away from in order to appreciate what you are stepping back to. She told her sister about Marius over dinner one Sunday afternoon, in a restaurant 3 streets from her flat, where the autumn light came through the windows in long golden bars and everything felt very normal and very solid. Her sister, practical, sharp, entirely undramatic about most things, sat across from her and listened to the broad outlines of it with the focused attention she brought to everything. "He is a 700-year-old vampire king," her sister said at the end of the summary. "Yes, and you work for him, I work with him, the distinction matters, and you are in love with him." Dahlia considered denying or modifying this and decided against it. Yes, her sister was quiet for a moment, looking at the window and its bars of autumn gold. Then she said, "Is he good to you?" "He is extraordinary to me," Dahlia said, and the simplicity of it was true in a way that needed no elaboration. Her sister nodded slowly. "Then I will adjust." This was, Dahlia thought, the most important conversation she had ever had in that restaurant, and she carried the simplicity of it back to the archive with her that evening, along with the fading afternoon light on her skin and the ordinary warmth of the world above, and she sat at the long reading table and wrote it into her account. Not the formal court record, but the private one she had been keeping since the night she had walked into the archive and demanded her name back. She was writing it when Marius came in, and he sat beside her at the table and read over her shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of someone who knows they are allowed. And when she reached the part about her sister's question and her own answer, she felt his hand come to rest against the small of her back with a steadiness that she recognized as his particular version of being moved. "You told your family," he said, "the relevant part of it." She kept writing. "I thought it was time to stop having the two parts of my life exist in complete ignorance of each other." "And your sister's response?" She said she would adjust. Dahlia set down her pen and looked at him. "She will." He looked at her for a moment with something she now knew perfectly well how to read. Something that in a less disciplined person would have been visible for a long time, something that in him had spent centuries being carefully contained, and that had, in the last months, gradually and irrevocably uncontained itself. "I love you," he said. The words were simple and direct and utterly certain, the way he was, when he had thought something through completely and arrived at the truth of it. Not a dramatic declaration. He was not a dramatic man. Or rather, he was dramatic in the sense that 7 centuries of presence makes everything slightly larger. But he was not theatrical, not performative. Just honest, finally and completely honest. Dahlia felt the full weight of it settle over her like something warm and permanent. "I know," she said, which was not a deflection but an acknowledgement. She had known for some time, had watched it building in the particular ways he showed it, in the coffee and the correct books and the standing between her and danger with his whole body and the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking back. "And," he said, with a dry undertone that meant he was both entirely certain of her answer and prepared to wait as long as it took for her to give it in her own time. She turned in her chair to face him fully, this ancient, white-haired, iron-eyed king who had spent 7 centuries building the safest possible record of everything and had finally, at her arrival, discovered something he could not catalogue from a careful distance. "I love you," she said. "I have been loving you since approximately the 3rd month I worked here, which I have been failing to admit to myself for approximately 3 years and 8 months, which is embarrassing but also honest, and you deserve the honest version." His expression was everything. He kissed her with a warmth that had accumulated over all those months and all the years before them when neither of them had said this thing, and she kissed him back with everything she was. Scholar, archivist. The woman who had walked into a vampire court demanding her name back and had never once regretted it. The archive breathed around them. The candles burned low. Above them, 40 feet of city hummed with its ordinary human business, unknowing. Down here was the record. Down here was the truth. 1 year after the night Dahlia had slammed the Brennevar ledger on the stone table, the Nocturne Court's autumn formal session opened with the Royal Archivist's presentation of the completed Nocturne Historical Index. 5 years of accumulated work finally assembled into its full form, cross-referencing every significant court document with its historical context and precedents. It was, by any assessment, the most significant organizational achievement in the archive's history, and the court received it accordingly. Dahlia presented it from the archivist's dais, with the composed, methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, and when she was finished, the senior House representative responded with something the court's protocol records would later describe as unanimous formal acclamation, which was, in vampire court terms, the institutional equivalent of a standing ovation. Afterward, in the archive, she and Marius sat at the long table with the completed index between them, the physical document, which was 3 volumes, and weighed considerably more than it had Arita to given that she had structured it for practical use. And she felt the particular completion that comes from a project that has been your companion long enough to become part of how you understand yourself finally being finished. "It is extraordinary," Marius said. He had read all 3 volumes, not for the first time. "It will change how this court understands its own history. That is the intention." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the archive, the ancient stone vaulting that had been here for centuries before her and would be here for centuries after. Can I tell you something that might sound strange? Everything you say is interesting, he said. The strange ones are the best. She smiled. I came here 4 years ago because it was the most extraordinary archival position in the world, and I would have been a fool to turn it down. I stayed because the work is genuinely the most significant I have ever done. She paused. But what I did not expect, and what I would not trade for anything, is you. She looked at him. The work and you, the record and you, this place and you. It is all one thing to me now, and it is the best thing I have ever had. He reached across the table and took her hand with that steady, certain grip, and held it. You walked in here and demanded your name back, he says, and in doing so, you gave me mine. He met her eyes with everything open in them. I had been the king for so long that I had stopped being anything else. You reminded me that there is a person inside the position, and that the person is allowed to want things, is allowed to love things. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles with the formal, particular tenderness of someone whose affection is expressed through precise and deliberate gestures. You gave me that. The archive was warm around them, candlelit and full of history, and they sat together in the record they had built. His centuries and her decades, both of them preserved in the same document, her name written back in by her own hand and never to be erased again. There were still difficult things ahead. There would always be difficult things ahead. Courts and politics and the asymmetry of time, and the countless negotiations of a life built between two worlds. Dahlia was clear-eyed about all of it, had always been clear-eyed. It was one of the things he loved most about her. But tonight, in the archive, the difficult things were quiet. Tonight there was only this, the record and the truth, and the man across the table who had spent 700 years learning what to protect and had found, in the end, that the most important thing was not the archive at all. It was her. She was the record worth keeping. She was the name worth writing. She was the discovery that no amount of careful management had been able to contain. Because she had walked into his court with a ledger and a grievance, and 4 years of accumulated brilliance, and she had simply refused to be erased. And in refusing, she had rewritten both their histories into something neither of them had been expecting. Something irrevocable, something true, something that would last. In the record, in the court, in the long candlelit history of the Nocturne Archive, and in the far more private and infinitely more permanent record of two people who had found each other in the middle of a crisis and built, in its aftermath, the most honest and complete thing either of them had ever known, Dahlia Holloway. Written back into the record, in her own hand, in indelible ink, and, beside her name, always his.